Are you the type of person that enjoys reading, but you find fantasy a little bit daunting? Are you someone who's never really read very much, but you would like to get into reading and fantasy sounds interesting to you? Have you tried reading fantasy before, but you hit a lot of roadblocks that prevent you from being able to enjoy it? Well, this video is for you. For me, reading fantasy has been one of my favorite artistic experiences to be able to absorb throughout my entire life. But as someone who loves fantasy and would like to see more people be able to enjoy this art form, I can admit that there are some major things you need to overcome to be able to enjoy fantasy, and I would like to sympathize with you who've struggled before. I think it's best to be honest and admit that there are a lot of things that make it difficult to get into fantasy, especially if you are not a reader normally, because I would love to have more people be able to experience the joys of reading fantasy. If you've been curious about the genre as an outsider, as someone who reads other things, or someone that doesn't do a lot of reading at all, reading in general can be a very big commitment of time, and oftentimes fantasy is one of the biggest time commitments there is. There's a reason why fantasy books are often so large, but dedicating the time it takes to read a book that's thicker than your fist, that's a lot, especially when you open up the book and there is just all kinds of strange proper nouns that you've never seen before, names that are hard to pronounce, worlds that feel completely foreign to our own, and you just are completely lost. And then maybe you've gotten on Reddit or clicked on a YouTube video trying to get into the fantasy genre and they use a bunch of terms that you can't understand. Not only do the books seem to be speaking a different language, but the people talking about the books also seem just as incomprehensible. I would like to use this video as an onboarding point for being able to understand what the genre is, what makes it cool, things to expect, and ways to navigate those difficulties. The first point I'd like to address on this topic that makes reading fantasy difficult, and you may have experienced this problem for yourself, is that a lot of fantasy is written for people that already enjoy fantasy. There can be a lot of storytelling tropes or shorthands used when someone is telling a story or describing the world inside of a fantasy book that assumes a certain level of competency about the genre, and I think that can be difficult. Since I'm generally speaking in this video to people that aren't familiar with fantasy, I'm going to address one of the fantasy genre specific terms that you may hear thrown around a lot and try to explain what it is and the importance of it in this genre, and that is the term world building. World building is named simply enough, and of course it is the process of building the world, but something that's worth considering when you pick up a book from the fantasy shelf at your bookstore is that one of the goals of fantasy books is to be able to lose ourselves in a world that is unlike our own in either major or minor ways. At the top level, fantasy can be subcategorized into two major types of subgenres. That is high fantasy and low fantasy. Low fantasy is a broad term for fantasy that includes elements that are supernatural or magical in some way, but exist with at least a piece of it based in the normal world that we all live in. If you take a book like Harry Potter, it is a low fantasy. It exists in our world, but there's this entirely hidden subset of magical people that exist on the same planet that we do, but it's this hidden subset of a magical school with magical people that are keeping their powers hidden from the rest of us. Twilight is another example. The Vampire Diaries, the show Supernatural, those would be classified as urban fantasy, which is it takes place in like an urban environment, but there is usually this secret culture of magical undercurrent. In some ways, it may be easier to get into low fantasy because it's going to contain elements that we're already familiar with, especially if we're already reading books. But even then, there can be a lot of shorthand or tropes that are common in these types of series that if you've never checked out the genre before, you may not know. Like, why are werewolves and vampires always at war with each other? If you've never been exposed to the world of a fantasy book, it can be very difficult when you are just trying to catch your bearings and everything seems new and unfamiliar to you. But if you try to talk about the series with other people that are commonly reading fantasy, no one seems to be feeling the feelings that you're describing of just like exploring this stuff for the first time. I truly do feel you, and don't let anyone squash the confusion or the excitement that you may have when you're experiencing something that seems commonplace to everybody else. Now, high fantasy, on the other hand, the other of these broad subcategories, is the type of fantasy that takes place in a world that is not our own. It's entirely fantastical and fictional in its makeup. These are very frequently the types of books that you pick up, and there is just a ton of words you don't understand, a ton of politics for places you don't understand, and it can be incredibly overwhelming. For someone that is trying to get into high fantasy, here's one of the biggest pieces of advice that I will give you. It's okay if you feel completely lost and you feel like you don't understand anything that's happening. One of the draws of this genre is that it takes place in an entirely separate world. For people that love fantasy, they don't have a hard time adjusting to this jump. But if you haven't experienced this before, it's so jarring and you can't understand why people might like it. And I think one of the reasons for this is that fantasy readers have come to accept that when you are starting a new fantasy series or a new fantasy book, you will be in the dark, and that's okay. It's actually part of the fun. I cannot name a single high fantasy book that I have not picked up and then in the prologue or the first couple chapters felt like I knew nothing and understood nothing of what was going on. That's actually normal for the genre, but it's not a negative, it's a positive. At some point you have to be exposed into this new world and everyone is going to be lost. Because these types of books tend to be really long, and because at times they can have slower parts, oftentimes fantasy books will start with a prologue that is super action based. It may be based like super far in the past or super far in the future, and it's just trying to get you interested in something. It's just trying to sink its hooks into you. But if you don't feel like you're clicking with what's going on because you don't understand the purposes of what is happening and why it's happening, that's okay. That's not a problem with you. It's just part of the genre, and people that are into it have learned that when you are starting a new fantasy world, you're not going to understand anything that's happening. Oftentimes you won't remember anything that happened in the prologue until maybe it comes up later. It's probably going to have a bunch of names that you're not going to recognize in the first couple chapters, and you're going to be wondering why it existed in the first place. Those prologues generally exist to draw in people that are into fantasy and they want to know what's different about this type of fantasy. But if you aren't one of the initiated, it's rough. And that's where I go back to the term world building. Because fantasy books try to draw us out of the regular world and into either a version of our world that is so much more than we could normally experience, or a new world entirely, world building is the process of acclimating yourself to this new environment, and how well that's done, or the method of how it's done. You'll often be exposed to different creatures or cultures or politics that may or may not line up with other tropes that have been in the genre for a long time. You may be familiar with some of them, you may not be familiar with a lot of them. These books are going to start with a map that's at the beginning of the book and you have no idea what it means, but as you start reading the book, you may want to look at those places on the map to help you understand the geography of what's going on. But good fantasy won't leave you in the dark forever, and as you progress through the book, you will find connection points, either with characters or with plot points, and you will be able to start piecing the world together yourself. You will find that when discussions happen online about the world building of a book, it's how well, for that individual person, because of course it's a subjective element when you're rating art, how well the process of building this entirely new world or setting worked for the individual, how deep it is, how much the world, even though it is entirely fictional, felt real, and how well that resonated with the individual reader. A major element of both high fantasy and low fantasy is another term that people that talk about fantasy books all the time throw around, and that is the term magic system. If you're the type of person that doesn't read fantasy normally, you may be confused at what that term means, because you'll think, well, this world has magic, can't they just do the magic thing? But that's not how the genre works. Once again, I'm going to break up the term magic system into two specific types of magic systems that exist, and that is a soft magic system and a hard magic system. Magic systems are the way that magic works in the specific world of the book that you're picking up, and yeah, it's basically going to be different in every single fantasy book that you read. So not only are you going to be exposed to a world that is entirely unlike your own, there's also going to be this entire other element of magic that exists in this world that's part of what fantasy is, that you're going to have to figure out, and it's okay if you don't get it at first. Low magic systems are the type of magic systems that are more mysterious. The rules don't seem to be entirely confined. Characters will do things with magic and you never really know what's gonna happen. A common criticism against that type of magic system is that you have no idea what's possible in the magic system, so a lot of times the end of the story will feel like a Deus Ex Machina, or parts of the story will feel like that, where a character just comes in and saves the day with magic and you don't feel like it had any emotional payoff because you didn't understand what was going on or possible in the first place. Once again, that's all on a subjective scale and it's not going to be the same for everybody, but that's generally what the term means. A hard magic system is something that is usually a lot more defined, almost to the point where the magic in the world feels like a new science that you weren't taught in school. Brandon Sanderson is probably one of the biggest fantasy authors that exists in our time. He's also an author that uses hard magic systems almost exclusively, and he will spend a lot of the book explaining to you how the magic works, and then you will understand what power level characters have and how they're able to accomplish the things that they accomplish. That takes away a lot of the whimsy, but it's also an element of world building that once you become acclimated to the existence of magic in in this fictional world, it can contain a lot of depth. One of the things that you will hear fantasy fans talk about when they're reviewing a book often is, did I like the magic system? Did I not like the magic system? Was it interesting or not? That's going to be entirely subjective, and here is where I'm going to talk about something that may not be super popular. Oftentimes, I think the people that are most knowledgeable and studied in something inherently become less relatable to regular people. People that read and talk about fantasy all of the time are going to have very different perspectives than someone just picking up fantasy for the first time. Things that they feel are really tired tropes or cliches may be extremely new to you, and it is okay to pick up a book that you think sounds interesting, even if a lot of people poop on it, and it's okay to love it. It's equally as okay to pick up a super popular fantasy book, realize it's not working for you because of whatever reason, and try reading something else that maybe people think is too derivative or too simple. Don't let fan communities of a book ruin your experience of enjoying a book for yourself. The process of reading a fantasy book can be a huge time commitment. There are too many awesome things in the world to experience to waste your time on something that is not working for you because somebody else thinks that it's awesome. That being said, it's also not great to stick in your bubble of things that you know that you like, and you may be missing out on something really cool. Because of this, if you are reading something that you are loving, regardless of what other people are saying about it, it's okay to enjoy it. If you pick up a new series and you're reading the first book and everyone says that first book is terrible, it gets way better later on, don't let that affect the fact that the first book may be speaking to you in a way that is super cool and unique. Fantasy fans can be some of the most passionate fan bases I've ever experienced, and sometimes that passion can be used for good, and sometimes that passion can be used for evil. Love the books that you love and hate the books that you hate, and don't let other people's experiences ruin your own. These are some of the most popular high fantasy and low fantasy books on the market. They are extremely different. The fan bases for these things will often not have any crossover in their Venn diagram, except for maybe me. I'm a weird exception. And you will often hear people from both of these fandoms hating on the other fandom. Both of these experiences are fantasy, and both of them are extremely valuable. I would say both of them are extremely good and mean a lot to different people. If you're the type of person that wants to try reading fantasy for the first time, but you're not really a reader in general, someone who's never read something for pleasure, or it's been a long time maybe, and the idea of staring at a piece of paper or a device for hours and hours on end, I'm talking a lot of hours for some of these books. If that sounds like too much, but you still want to know what it's about, give audiobooks a shot. Audiobooks don't work great for everyone. Some people in the reading community tend to hate audiobooks, but I personally think they are amazing. Dyslexia is a super common thing that makes it hard for people to read. Or maybe, as I mentioned before, you just don't have the time to commit to sitting down and reading a book all the time. Audiobooks are a great way to experience fantasy also, especially if it's something you're not used to. It may seem obvious, but audiobooks are just having the full book read to you by someone who's usually paid to do it in an interesting way. Audiobook narrators can help you interpret the mood of a story by changing their voice and inflection to match the scene. They can also do different character voices that can help you immerse yourself in an experience in something that at least gives a little bit closer feel to something like television. If you want to try to experience something in fantasy, try listening to an audiobook. One of the difficult things that can come with listening to fantasy on audiobooks is that you are going to feel like the information that's coming at you is coming at you maybe even harder than if you're reading it, because you can't go back and reread a passage. But in some ways, for new readers, that might be a good thing, because you're not going to get overly hung up on something. If you don't understand something, the reading is going to continue, and it will keep continuing until you finally feel at place in the world and you can start getting a grasp of what's going on. Personally, I think the expansion of the audiobook industry has been one of the most inclusive and really cool things happening in reading in general, but also in fantasy, because I do think that a lot of people are able to listen to audiobooks for fantasy where they would never have read one of these books in the freaking 40 hours or whatever it may take you. Also, if you're not a fast reader, but you're able to comprehend what's happening in a story, you can speed up audiobooks to whatever speed you want to, or if it's going too fast, you can slow them down. It's really easy in every major audiobook application that I've ever used, whether it's related to a library, whether it's Scribd or Libro FM or Audible. It's extremely likely if you're watching this video, you've heard someone advertised Audible on something before. Audible is Amazon's audiobook platform. It's really, really easy to use. It's really easy to find and purchase books there, download them to your phone, and then listen to them at the speed that you want to, whenever you want to. If you're really having a hard time reading a book, but you want to give it the best shot possible, sometimes it can be valuable to try reading the book while listening to the audiobook to absorb it fully, but for a lot of people, that can be a lot to ask. Something worth noting is that if you buy the digital copy of a book on Amazon, it usually includes a discount for the audiobook version, and if you are reading it on one of your digital devices, whether it's a Kindle or a phone or an iPad, it will sync your progress with the audio version if you have that, and you can listen when you're driving and read it when you get a second at home. That can be a great way to work through a book that's huge faster. The last tip I'll give is pick a book that sounds awesome to you. It's not hard on YouTube or just on Google to search for books that are like X. If you like a certain television show or movie or video game, you can Google for books that are like that thing, and oftentimes you'll find results for almost anything. If you like a show like Game of Thrones or The Witcher, or a movie like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, you may want to check out the book versions of those things. A lot of times, book fans will say that the book version is better than the television or movie adaptation. If you like a movie or you like a television show, give the book a shot. But just know that the audience for those types of things are often used to those types of things in book format. If you just get on Reddit and you look at the list of best fantasy books that exist, and then you pick up one of those books from the library or from a store, there may be a lot going on and it may be difficult to get through, and that's okay if it doesn't work for you. In a modern context, for someone that's not used to reading, picking up Lord of the Rings could be really hard to read. The book was written a super long time ago. It doesn't follow modern storytelling ideals in a lot of ways. I think it's beautiful in its own way, but also I'm going to be biased because I am warped with having a fantasy brain already. Books like The Name of the Wind, The Witcher, The Way of Kings, Mistborn, these are some of the biggest fantasy books that exist, but they can be daunting. Pick the one that sounds coolest to you, and know that you can't just take the advice of all of the videos on YouTube that say, if you want to try fantasy, pick up this book, because sometimes you'll pick up that book and be just so freaking lost. And now I'll talk about one of the biggest payoffs for reading something in the fantasy genre. If you've ever loved a long-running television series, one of the things that you will probably love about that series is the fact that you have gotten to know characters over the course of a long period of time. As you see the characters and the story develop, you can form a sort of personal connection to them even though they're fictional. Fantasy series often will use their massive length and scope to tell a story that just won't work in other media. It can take place over a lot more time or a lot more space, or they can tell stories that you just couldn't tell in a modern context, or stories you could tell in a modern context, but it's entirely reshaped by the fact that there's magic in the world. Maybe a certain type of magic can create a different type of geopolitical climate that causes interesting interactions between two warring factions. Maybe you could have a romance story that takes place between two different characters, but for whatever reason there's different types of prejudices that exist. Maybe there can be magic that allows people to teleport across the world, and that changes everything about the way that the regular world would normally work. There's so many reasons that fantasy could work, but oftentimes the extra depth and the extra things that fantasy books require of you, they require you to spend more time and effort to understand them. If it's a good fantasy book, it will often reward you for those things with experiences that are unlike anything else. The first time you feel yourself teleported through your mind into a story, and you cry over a character death, or you cheer at a battle, and you realize you're just staring at words on a page or listening to someone just read words from a page, it can be so cool. It can be such an eye-opening experience that is almost on some ways like transcendent. Experiencing that for the first time will make the pain that you had to go through to get that experience worthwhile, and I feel like once you've tasted it before, you can understand why people continue to do this thing, even if it seemed completely untouchable from the outside. When a fantasy series finally clicks and you just can't stop reading it, and then you finish it and you feel like you had all of these crazy powerful wonderful experiences and you don't know who to talk to about them because you don't know anybody in real life that reads these experiences? No, these people exist. They are online. YouTube channels like mine and many, many other people that I know from the internet. We would love to talk about books with you, especially fantasy books, especially if you're experiencing them for the first time. I am so excited anytime I talk to someone that has just discovered their love for the fantasy genre, and I would love to help guide you along that journey in any way that I can. If you find yourself in a place where you start experiencing fantasy for the first time and you love it and you want to freak out and talk to somebody about it, but nobody seems to care, you've come to the right place. If you want to chat about that experience in an online forum, there is a link in the description of this video down below to a Discord server, which is just an online type chat room, and you can join. And there in my Discord server are general channels to just talk to readers, and most of the readers that are in there are science fiction or fantasy readers. And there's even a lot of specified channels for talking about specific series. So if you're not super well read and you just want to talk about something specific, there's the opportunity for that. If you're curious and you want to hear what type of exciting experiences are happening in the fantasy world, thanks for coming to this channel. I hope you subscribe. I spend basically all of my time here freaking out about how awesome the fantasy world can be and my excitement for interacting with these wonderful fictional worlds and my friends who like to do the same things. If you would like to see more of that type of content, I would love it if you subscribed. And if you liked this video, if it was valuable for you, you smash that like button. It lets YouTube know I provided some service to somebody somewhere. Please comment down below if something I said resonated with you in any way, or if you have advice to new fantasy readers that I may have missed. Thank you so much for watching, but I can't tell you what to do. I'm not your dad, but I am your best friend. Goodbye.
Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.